my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Alona Fyshe. She's currently an assistant professor in the computer science and psychology departments at the University of Alberta. Alona's background is in computer science, both as a bachelor's and master's student at the University of Alberta, and she also holds a PhD in machine learning for Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Fyshe uses machine learning to analyze brain images collected while people read, which allows her to study how humans represent meaning they encounter in text. In parallel, she also studied how computer learns to represent meaning when trained on either text or images. And today she's going to share with us some of her work with EEG to explore how new semantic mappings form in the brain. So with that, let me welcome Dr. Fyshe. Alona, whenever
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Hopefully, we had some audio trouble, so I'm hoping everyone. Hello, can you hear me? Somebody nod. Yes, okay, great. Okay, so we're gonna do our very best and hopefully this will all work out. So I'm gonna talk today about an interesting experiment we did where we actually tested to see if we could see the representation of words in people's brains right after they had learned a new word in a new language. So I should say that that's a word they know in their native language, but they just learned the new orthographic representation in a new language. This will all make sense when we get into the details of it. And all this study stems from the idea that language is easy and it's effortless, really, once you've learned it. But of course, learning a new language is really hard. And so we were interested in some of what happens in the very early stages of learning a new language when you're learning just word meaning in order to build up your vocabulary so that you can move on to learning more complex features of language. So previous work you might be familiar with has used fMRI and MEG, for example, and EEG in order to explore comprehension and meaning representations in native languages. There's a lot of work in this area. But it all focused on how the brain represents language in a language you're fluent in and often your native language. So our question is, can we detect the learning that's happening? And then beyond that, can we detect the actual learned content? So if we look at the brain, can we see that the representation in your brain is as we would expect for your native language? And is there a difference between the sort of timing and spatial representation of that newly learned meaning if we were to compare it to the meaning of the word in your native language? Okay, so I like to tell people a little bit about my history. So here I did my PhD in Pittsburgh, as was mentioned, which is close to you now. And then I moved to, now I live in Alberta, sorry. And then originally though, I moved to Victoria, and then I recently moved back to Alberta. So in Victoria, I worked with, this is my student Chris Foster from the University of Victoria, as well as Olaf Kugolson and Chad Williams, who are also at the University of Victoria. And Olaf and Chad are the people who actually collected this data and performed the experiment, and then Chris and I did the computational analysis we'll talk about today. Okay, so generally we're going to talk first about how we look for language in the brain. So we'll talk about computer models of language meaning, and then we'll talk about how we map those computer models onto the brain. And then from there, we'll talk about the actual language learning paradigms, the actual experiment we ran to study how a new language is acquired. And then I'll talk about the results that we had for that particular data that was collected. Okay, so first, computer models of word meaning. So we need to represent semantics with a computer. And to think about how we might do that, it's useful to think about how you represent semantics. So this is usually an audience participation part of the talk, but I'll fill in for you for this particular example. So usually what I say is, tell me things that are similar to an orange. And people often say things like grapefruit, lemons. I've also had somebody say ball in the past, which is sort of interesting because maybe it has the same shape as an orange, but so I get a lot of interesting answers to this question. I sometimes hear apple. I sometimes hear banana. I have never had anyone say car. And I have never had anyone say sandwich, even though sandwich is actually something you would eat. So you have in your mind a representation of what words mean, what words are similar. So when I ask you to search the space in your mind around orange, you don't search and find car. You don't search even and find sandwich. You search and you find nearby fruits. And so that tells you something about how your brain represents meaning. And so we could think about maybe in your mind you have some high dimensional space, but let's pretend right now it's just two-dimensional. Maybe your brain only has 2 dimensions of meaning, whether or not something is sweet and whether or not something grows on a tree. And so you would find in the upper right-hand corner all of your fruit examples, so banana, apple, orange. And then sandwich and car, they don't grow on trees and they're not sweet, so they're on the bottom left-hand side. So in this particular semantic representation, it explains why when I asked you to tell me things that are similar to an orange, you said apple and banana, but you didn't say car and sandwich. Of course, your brain is much more, your brain's representation of language meaning is way more complex than this. And that's part of the research that I work on. So what I've just explained to you here is this idea that there are dimensions of semantic meaning and the words live in the space defined by those dimensions is a vector space model of semantics. So in a vector space model of semantics, every word has a point. And so, for example, here sandwich maybe has 0 and 0.03 as its point, because maybe it's like slightly sweet, but it certainly doesn't grow on a tree. And so the points in space define word meaning, and we would hope that because of that, we would find words with similar meaning close to each other. So this is a good example of a semantic space that is good in some respects in that the fruit is together, but bad in other respects in that car and sandwich appear to be very similar things in the semantic space. And that's because here we only have 2 dimensions and they're not very good dimensions. What we need to do is scale up this model so that we can differentiate more English words. So we need to be able to differentiate thousands of English words. And so in order to do that, we're going to need many, many more dimensions to our semantic space. So if we were trying to do this by hand, we would need to define those dimensions manually, hundreds of dimensions. And then we would need to put each one of the words in a defined space, so tens of thousands of words. So we would have to define for tens of thousands of words their values for hundreds of dimensions. And so it's completely tedious and error-prone and not something as a computer scientist I would want to do. So computer scientists are always figuring out ways to try to do things that are tedious and error-prone with computers. That's essentially what the original research in this area was. It was, we were going to take a computer and try to build a representation of meaning automatically. So we're going to use a large text corpus. So for the vector space model I'll talk about today, that large text corpus is Google News. So it's a collection of many, many news stories. And we're going to from that, build a vector space model of semantics. And we can think that this large corpus represents some average semantic space. So in that collection of news stories, many different people wrote those news stories. You can sort of think of it as like something we could all agree upon as being a representation of semantics that we would, in many ways, agree with. So different people have different feelings about different words, but for the most part, we agree about a large core of semantic meaning. So just like before, when we were talking about our very simple picture where we had sweetness and grows on a tree, we have words, and associated with each word is a set of numbers. So originally we only had 2 numbers, but now we're talking about expanding the number of numbers associated with each word so that the dimensionality is much higher and we can differentiate words much better. Okay, so we're going to process the large text corpus like I described, and what we're looking for is to find words that are associated with our words of interest. So let's say we're interested in the word banana. If we looked nearby the word, every time we saw the word banana in our large text corpus, we might find that it often appears with the verb appears with the verb eat, and less often with the verb drive. So that makes it more similar to apple, but less similar to car. And so those word association patterns are what we're looking for when we build these computational models of language meaning. And the implied hypothesis there is that you can infer a word's meaning by the way that it's used. And that actually ends up being really powerful and really successful. So there's past work, I guess that's coming up, that's more than 30 years ago that LSA was first published. And then the model I'm using today is called Skipgram, published originally in 2013, still quite a popular model because of its simplicity. So both of these models use patterns of word co-occurrence in order to infer word meaning. So skipgram is actually under the hood a very simple neural network with only one hidden layer. And that neural network is trained to predict nearby words. So it's given a central word as the input. So here, for example, in this top example here, the input word would be banana. And it's trained such that it can predict nearby words with high probability. So you might often see the word 8 and the word yellow near the word banana. And so if I give this neural network after training, if I give this neural network the word banana, I would expect it to predict, give a probability distribution where words like 8 and yellow have high probability and words like drive have lower probability. And so once I had that trained model, the vectors that I use for my vector space model are actually come from that single hidden layer of the neural network. And so that single hidden layer of the neural network for each one of the words will represent the word meaning. And that ends up being actually extremely powerful and one of the better word embedding models that exists today. And so now that I have this word embedding model, what can I do with it? So one thing you can do is, there's several things you can do with this, and some of them are sort of simple word tasks. So human judgments of word similarity is an example of something that correlates really well to distances in these word embedding spaces. You can also use them to answer things like these TOEFL synonym questions, and also do things like role fillers for agents and patients of verbs with fairly good accuracy. So essentially, some of the things we ask people to do to test if people know language, the word vector models can also do those tasks, implying that they also understand language to some extent. Another really fun example of what you can do with these word embedding models or vector space models is track the change of word meaning over time. So here are 3 examples of how particular words have changed their meaning over time. And my favorite example here is this broadcast example. So I didn't know that broadcast actually used to mean sowing seeds. So it used to mean to distribute seeds in a field. And that was in the 1850s, but as first newspapers were created and started being widely distributed in the 1900s, broadcast took on a new meaning to send out papers. And then now we know what broadcast to mean something to do with sending signals over radio or even over the internet. So then you can see how the meaning of the word has changed over time because the way we use that word has changed over time. And so this sort of illustrates the power of these word embedding models. They are actually really good representations of word meaning. Okay, so that's computer models of word meaning, and now we're going to talk briefly about how we can take those computer models of word meaning and map them onto the brain. So here we have our vector space model derived from a text corpus. So for every word, we have a vector. And now we're also going to take our fMRI or EEG, MEG data and use it in order to find a relationship between the vector space model and the brain imaging data. So you could use fMRI, you could use MEG. Here we're going to use EEG. But essentially, in every case, what you would do is take your brain imaging data and turn it into some long vector. So for EEG, which is just a bunch of sensory readings over time, we just lay the sensory readings end to end. So all of the readings for all of the time for sensor 1, and then all of the readings for all of the time for sensor 2, and so on and so forth. So it really is like literally the simplest thing you could think of doing with this EEG data. There's nothing really special done to indicate that any nearby points are correlated, are close together in time, or that sensors are close together. The vector doesn't really represent any of that in a way that the model understands. It's really the simplest way you could represent this data. But actually ends up, from our work, working quite well anyway. Okay, so once we have these, what we call feature vectors that represent the brain imaging data, what we're going to do is something that's a little atypical in this field. We're averaging over all trials and all participants for a single word. So past work had built the average all trials within a participant and then build a model within a participant and test that model within a participant and then report the average accuracy across all participants. So we're doing something slightly different here. EEG data is quite noisy, but it has a nice spatially smooth signature. And so this actually works in our advantage here because we can average over all participants without actually doing any co-registration of the brain activity. So we just did this, again, the simplest thing you could possibly think of doing, averaging across all participants, even though, you know, that their heads have different shapes and those EEG helmets are definitely on in different ways each time. this ended up working for us, I think, because the EEG signal is so smooth. Okay, so then we have our brain data average over all of the participants and all of the trials for a particular word. And what we're going to do is use those averages in order to train a regression model. So each one of the betas here in this picture represents a regression model. It's trained using L2 regularized regression, such that each one of the regression models independently predicts one of the dimensions of the word embedding. So it takes as input a brain image, and it produces as output a prediction for one of the dimensions of the word embedding, the vector space model. And we'll just concatenate together all of those predictions in order to define a point in the high dimensional semantic space defined by the vector space model. So again, each one of these models that predict a particular dimension of the semantic space is independent. So again, another place where we did the simplest thing possible, but again, it ended up working really well. And so we need to test our model on Held-out data in order to make sure that it actually generalizes well, that we're actually learning patterns that are true to the data and not just signatures or idiosyncrasies of the noise. Okay, so here's an example where we have, again, two semantic dimensions, but now it's is it alive and is it big? So we have some things that are alive and some things that are not alive, big and small. And I'm going to train my regression model here using these black points. And I'm going to hold out my brain image for mouse and my brain image for house. And I'm also going to hold out the corresponding vectors from the vector space model for mouse and house. So I'm going to create two predictions using the EEG data of the held-out words. So I have some EEG data, we'll call it EEG1. I'll use my learned beta weights in order to produce prediction 1. I'll do the same thing for the second EEG image to produce prediction 2. And those two predictions, like we talked about, correspond to points in this space. So prediction 1 here appears, it appears that the model thinks it is alive, but it's small. And the prediction 2, it is not alive and it's large. And so you can see here, the two held-out words are mouse and house. And our two predictions are prediction 1 and prediction 2 here. And the task here in the 2 versus 2 test is, can we assign prediction 1 and prediction 2 to the two held-out words without knowing which of the two words prediction 1 and prediction 2 are assigned to ahead of time. So essentially we're asking, can the model that we've trained differentiate between two words? So I'm giving you two EEG samples. I'll say one of these is mouse, one of these is house. Your job is to decide which is mouse and which is house. And so here, it's easy to see that prediction 1 is probably mouse and prediction 2 is probably house. And the way that you know that is that you can see that the distance between those pairs of words is smaller than the distance between the other assignment of prediction 2 to mouse and prediction 1 to house. So essentially, that's what the 2 versus 2 test here that we use to test our models does. It says, choose the assignment of predictions to held-out words that minimizes the sum of distance. So here, the sum of the length of the two red arrows is much smaller than the sum of the length of the green arrows. So we would choose prediction 1 is mouse and prediction 2 is house. So that's a 2 versus 2 test. And I'll report to you today 2 versus 2 accuracy, which is the percent of the 2 versus 2 tests we get correct. And we do all possible pairs, held out pairs of words from the data. And the reason we do this sort of weird 2 versus 2 test thing is because we're using two predictions to make one assignment. And because we have two predictions, we can account a little bit better for any noise that might appear in our prediction. So we can have one kind of noisy prediction. As long as the other one's okay, we might still get the 2 versus 2 test correct. So it allows us to better measure the difference between our model and a model that has chance accuracy. Now, so we use permutation tests to do that. And we see in our permutation test that the chance accuracy is 50% because you're making this, one of two choice decision. Okay, so the overall framework looks like this. We have some corpus. We use it to build the word-to-vec algorithm, the skipgram algorithm, in order to build a vector space model. That vector space model tells us something about what words mean. We're going to select the rows of the vector space model that correspond to our stimuli words. And we'll use it on the bottom here along with the EEG data that we collect. And we'll put it through our classification framework, which involves the regression model I described. and computes the 2 versus 2 accuracy. And so that 2 versus 2 accuracy is what we'll talk about when we're talking about the results. So now we're going to talk about the paradigm we used in order to collect this data. So we're having people come into the lab, and I should say actually Olav and Chad had people come into the lab in order to learn a new language, and they collected EEG data while they did that test. There's 24 subjects here. They scored an average of 9.7 on an English fluency test. They're very fluent in English. And they learned this new language, quote unquote, while EEG was collected here. So I'm saying language here because it's really unfair to call this a language. It's really just vocabulary learning. They're just learning this orthographic representation of a word they already know in their native language. So that's not learning a new language. That's learning vocabulary. But you could argue that that's maybe the first step along the way to learning a new language. And they learned this mapping in the EEG lab using reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning in the psychology meaning, not in the machine learning meaning, if you happen to know about that kind of reinforcement learning. But there's connections, of course. So I'll explain the paradigm in a second. So you probably know that EEG is recording the electrical activity of neurons. It has great time resolution. It has not so great spatial resolution, but of course it's cheaper than fMRI and can be collected almost anywhere because it doesn't need a magnetically shielded room. This is, we used that, so Olaf and Chris used, Chad used this ActiChamp system, 64 sensors that was collected at 500 hertz and was downsampled at 250 hertz. And now I will actually go through the actual paradigm now so you can get a sense of what the people were doing when they came into the lab. So they would be sitting in front of a screen and they would see, on each trial, they see a symbol. So the symbols were taken from Tamil and Manipuri alphabets. So they look something like this. People were naive to those two alphabets, so they had never seen these sorts of symbols before. So they would see this symbol, and then even from the very beginning, what happens is that they are presented with 4 options. So even on the very first trial, they don't know the meaning of any of these symbols. They're presented with 4 options, and they have to choose the meaning, what they think the meaning of this word is. So obviously, the very first time you see a symbol, you don't know what the meaning is. So you're going to make a guess. Say you guess dog, and you get it. The first time, you get it wrong, because you don't know that mapping yet. But then the next time you see the symbol, you're presented with 4 options and you think, okay, so I know it's not dog. What could it be? And maybe this time you guess run, and it turns out that that time you're correct. So it's this trial and error way of learning language. We don't have people study up front. You do not know the mapping of symbols to words. They learn it on the fly using this reinforcement learning paradigm. So at a very high level, this is what the paradigm looks like, and this is the timing. So when they start it, they see a fixation cross, and then they see one of these letters from the alphabet. They see it for that letter for 500 milliseconds, and then at 500 milliseconds, 4 words come on the screen, and they're to choose from those 4 words. Once they've made their selection, they see a fixation cross followed by feedback about whether they were correct or not, so a check or an X. And this repeats over and over again for many, many trials across 7 or maybe 18 blocks, something like that, many blocks. Different words are incorporated in each new block, and some of the old words are also used at each block. So every block has, after the first block, has some words that you've already learned as well as some new words. So it's sort of an iterative learning as well as reinforcement paradigm. So what we're interested in asking here is, first of all, we'll ask what is a pretty simple, shouldn't say simple, pretty standard question that you might ask from an ERP standpoint. Is there a difference in the ERP to the correct and incorrect, the brain's response to correct versus incorrect feedback? So does your brain do something different when you get a check versus when you get it? Now, from a machine learning standpoint, we want to ask a different question. We want to ask, is there a signature for the semantics of the native word here when you read the symbol itself? So here, during the time you're seeing the symbol, you have seen any English representation of this the word. Can we see the semantic signature of that native word? And then we'll ask also again, after you see the 4 word options, can we see a signature for the semantic representation of the word? So there were 60 words and 60 unique randomly chosen symbols, 54 nouns, 3 verbs, 3 pronouns. They were presented in random order across the blocks, across participants. So participants did not learn the words in the same order. Every participant learned the words in a different order. Yes, 19 blocks. So each of the words were introduced slowly over 19 blocks. And because of this random ordering of words across the blocks and across participants, each participant sees each word a different number of times. So some participants might see a word 2 times, some participants might see a word 10 times, depending on during which block they learned that word. Good, so now that's the paradigm. We're going to move on now to the results. So the very first thing we'll talk about is the reward positivity, or the ERP analysis, to see if people have a different response to the positive or negative feedback. So do we see a difference in the brain response at this particular sensor, FCz? Is there a difference in the brain's response to positive versus negative feedback? So if I get the word right, I choose from the 4 options and I'm right, or I choose from the 4 options and I'm wrong. So that's, you can imagine, a very different feeling, but does the brain signature also look different? So here we have voltage on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. This is the onset of the feedback here. So this is after you've seen the symbol, seen the choices, made your selection, then you see a fixation cross, and then you either see a check or an X. So this 0 here corresponds to the onset of that, either the check or the X. And these lines represent your brain's response to red here would be seeing a check, and blue here would be seeing the X. So you can see there's a big difference between getting a trial correct or incorrect. And this is the difference wave here. And you can see there's a significant difference between the 2 conditions at around between 200 and 300 milliseconds. So that's probably not news. That's something that's been seen before. Getting correct and incorrect feedback causes different responses in the brain. One thing that's interesting is that Chad and Olaf looked at whether your response changes as you receive additional positive feedback. So if the first time you get a word right, you can imagine you have like a little celebration in your brain. It's very exciting. And you do some serious learning. The second time you get it right, you might still be excited and happy, but you're probably doing a little less learning if you are doing any learning at all at that point. So maybe the brain's response to getting it right versus wrong is not so much about getting it right versus wrong as getting it right if you expected to get it right. And so here's the ERPs for each one of the rewards 1 through 6. So the first time you get a word right is the red line here, and then the 2nd through 6th time that you get a word right are the other lines. And you can see there's a big difference between getting that word right the first time and getting the word right subsequent times. So if you look at what would be sort of the peak here around 278 milliseconds, you can look at the peak across all of those different correct trials, and it falls off really quickly. So the first time you get it right, your brain has a big response, and you continue to have a response to getting that word right, but that response falls off really quickly this time. So now we're going to talk about whether we can, so we're going to show that people do learn language using this paradigm, and we're also going to look at if we can tell that they learned language using just the EEG signal alone. So what we're going to do is take all of the words that were presented at least 6 times to people, and this is because we want to make sure that the trials we have for a particular person are trials where they understand the word, they had enough chances to learn the word. And we're going to average all of the trials after the second repetition. So at all the trials, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to the number of times a particular person saw a word. So what we're trying to do here is really zone in on the trials after which somebody had learned the word, and we're trying to take mostly the trials where they have a good representation of the word. So remember what we're doing. We're taking the EEG signal. We're going to post here. So here this is post symbol onset. So that's after they see the symbol. We're going to take the average of their brain data at that point, train a model, so train a bunch of beta weights, and then predict a point in space. We're going to use the 2 versus 2 accuracy to tell whether or not we're doing a good job of that. So it turns out that we actually can see the learned representation of the native word when you see a symbol. So in the first 500 milliseconds, we get 2 versus 2 accuracy of 69%, which is much above chance, significantly above chance here. So even during the time you're viewing that symbol, you've learned the representation, you've learned the mapping of that symbol to your native language representation, and you're pulling it up in your mind. That's what we can see here. If we include the time that you see the choice, we see another bump in accuracy up to 79%. So that shows that there is a representation for the word before you see the choices, and it's even stronger if you include some of the time after you see the choices. So that's using the EEG data, but of course we actually had people responding to these questions. We have a record of how they did on this experiment, so we can actually look at the behavioral data. So these are the behavioral results. On the y-axis here we have the actual participant accuracy. So that's how many times a participant got a word right, not how many times the 2 versus 2 accuracy was right. So this is actual people button pressing here. And on the x-axis is the absolute trial. So because on the very first trial, the very first block, chance accuracy would be 25%. So the reason that this is not 25% for the first trial is that you learn new words every block. And so every block, you know, after the first block, you know some of the words and you don't know some of the words. And so it becomes easier and easier to sort of guess the meaning of the word as you progress through the experiment because you're starting to see words that you know quite well. And this is the average over all of the blocks. So if people were learning perfectly, we would expect them to get 71% on this very first trial. And so they're getting 65%, which is remarkably close to 71%. So they're doing very well on this first trial because they're using information about the other words in the set of 4 that are presented to them as choices. And they also learn very quickly. So even at the second trial, they're getting up into the high 70s for accuracy. And then by the 6th trial, they're close to 90% accurate. So people are definitely learning language using this paradigm, and they're doing it quite quickly. I should point out that, of course, especially on the very first trial, a lot of what you're seeing here is correct guesses. So people are not sure about what the word is, but they're making a guess and they get it right. So some of the correct answers we're seeing here are actually guesses that ended up being correct. So what we were interested in is, can we use our machine learning models to detect the learned contents of the representation in those very early trials? So can we detect what word they are learning using our EEG signal? So we should not be able to do that on the first trial. So even if a person gets it correct on the first trial, we wouldn't be able to see it in their EEG signal because they're guessing. But maybe by the third trial, they've learned the word, they see the symbol, they think of the word, maybe we'll be able to detect that we can see the native word they're thinking of when they see the symbol. So maybe on the third trial, maybe on the 6th trial. So we're essentially asking, as a function of the number of times they've seen the word, when can we tell, when can we see that mental representation of the native language meaning? So we know we can see it if we use all the data. We're asking here, can we see it if we only use some of the data, particularly the data from the very beginning of the experiment? Okay, so here on the y-axis now we have 2 versus 2 accuracy because this is the machine learning model accuracy. And on the x-axis we have the absolute trials averaged. We have to average together trials here because of signal to noise ratio problems. It requires a few trials averaged together in order to get some above chance results. So here we're averaging together trials 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 6. And so it's a window of 3 trials, so it's a fair comparison across the points. So each point is the average of 3 trials, and we're moving it through trial time, including more and more of the trials where we think they probably have learned the word. So we want to know, how does the 2 versus 2 accuracy change as we change the trials we're averaging together? And so this is the results. It's not until we average together the 4th, 5th, and 6th trial that we actually see average 2 versus 2 accuracy that's above chance. So that's what the asterisk means there. So we don't get what is the accuracy if we use all of the trials, because here we're only averaging together trials 4, 5, 6. So all trials accuracy is the red dotted line at the top. But we get above chance accuracy. And so we can actually see that early on, there is not a signature of the semantic representation of that word during the first few trials because they don't have it yet. They haven't learned how to map that symbol onto some semantic meaning. But we are able to see that they do that over time, and by the 4, 5, 6 trial, we get above chance accuracy. It's interesting to compare that to the behavioral results. The behavioral results show really quick learning, and they show that people are extremely stable by the 6th absolute trial. So if you compare that to our results from the EEG data, we don't see that same like really quick rapid learning. We see something that takes a little bit more time to happen. So part of that is because of the guessing that I described. So people are guessing, and that's why some of this behavioral participant accuracy is high. But as somebody pointed out another time I gave this talk, we're also seeing that people are better at interpreting their brain's representation of meaning than our models might be. So some of this just might be that early on, before that semantic representation is really solidified, it's harder to detect with EEG, it's harder for the machine learning models to pick out, but people are able to interpret their own mental representation better than we are, perhaps in those early trials. And another obvious question to ask is, where in the brain are you seeing these signatures of semantic representation, and when in the brain are you seeing these semantic representations? So that's what we'll turn to now. So the very first question is when. When in the brain are we seeing these semantic representations? So here, a similar graph where the y-axis is 2 versus 2 accuracy, but now the x-axis is time within a trial. So now we're averaging over all of the trials, and we're looking within those trials at the actual millisecond time series of accuracy as the sort of brain signal unfolds. So these are 100 millisecond words, 100 millisecond windows, and we're going to shift them, I think it's by 25 milliseconds. So this is the onset of the symbol. So this is during the time you see the symbol. And then here's the onset of the choices. So remember, you see the symbol, and then you see the 4 choices, and then you make your selection. So here is the plot of accuracy as a function of time. So we see very early on here a early peak in 2 versus 2 accuracy in response just to the symbol. So you do have a brain response to the symbol that has actually quite high accuracy, that's almost as high as the accuracy when we look later out in time here at 600 milliseconds. So after the onset of the choices, we also see a peak in accuracy. It's much more sustained, but it's actually not higher than that first initial peak after the onset of the symbol. So that first signature of the semantic representation after the onset of the symbol, it's high, but it's not sustained. Then after the onset of the choices, we also see the semantic representation, a signature of the semantic representation. It's about as high in 2 versus 2 accuracy, and it's more sustained. So it's above chance for longer. And these 2 windows, yellow windows here. So I should say these yellow windows represent points in time that are above chance. And again, we're not getting all the way up to all trials accuracy. Here we are actually using all of the trials, but we're just using little windows of time. So that's why we don't get all the way up to what would be all trials and all time accuracy here at almost 80%. Okay, and now where in the brain do we see the semantic representation? Okay, so we have 3 topographic plots here. On the very left-hand side is 0 to 500 milliseconds. In the middle, 500 to 1,000 milliseconds. And on the very right-hand side is the whole time period, 0 to 100 milliseconds. So that first plot on the left is during the time before you've seen the onset of the choices. So this is just during the time you're doing the symbol. And the second middle plot is during the time you've seen the choices before you make your response. And the last one is all of the time. So one thing to notice is that early in time, before you see the choices, we actually see the left lateralized signature that you might expect when you're studying language. It's a much more, it's much fainter response, and it definitely have this lateralized left-hand side signature. But after you see the actual words, we see something that's much more centralized and also much more robust. There are many more channels above chance, and we get higher accuracy in this 500 to 1,000 millisecond window. I should point out, though, that previous decoding studies have actually shown something that looks a lot more like the B topographic plot here. You see things that they tend to be pretty bilateral, and they tend to be sort of posterior central areas. So if you were to choose between 2 of these to say which of these looks more like the native language, I would say that B has a signature that looks more like somebody reading their native language, and actually they are, right? At this point in time, they're reading their choices. So there is a subtle difference between reading your brain's response to reading the symbol and your brain's response to reading the choices. And then if we use that average over the whole time, we see, again, this pretty bilateral response where the accuracy is, equally strong on each side of the brain. Okay, so that's what I had to talk about today. I'll just summarize my results for you quickly. This is the first time that a group has detected the semantic representation of a newly learned word. So there's been some work on L2 language understanding when you're fluent in your L2, but this is the first time that somebody has studied the semantic representations as you're learning a new language, to my knowledge. Past work had looked at native language, and there had been some critiques of that work, what had been detected were correlations of the visual features. So if you show somebody a word in their native language, what you might be detecting when you say you're decoding semantics in their brain might be something related to the visual features. So for example, like word length. Because we're using random symbols assigned to words, we've actually eliminated some of that correlation. So the symbols are randomly assigned to words, so there shouldn't be a correlation between what they're seeing on the screen and the word length. There is not a correlation between word length and the symbol they see on the screen. It could be that they are recalling the word in their mind and something about the phonetic signature correlates to the word vector. We can't get away from that, and we can't say that that's not what's happening here, but at least we've removed the fact that the visual stimuli is correlated to the word vectors. We also did not have to coach people to visualize the words. So some past work had shown people the words they were going to see in advance and asked them to do some work to visualize the words before they even went in the scanner, and then asked them to do a particular visualization task in the scanner. Because we have this really engaging reinforcement learning paradigm, we actually didn't have to ask them to do anything at all except just learn the language. So they're just playing this game, and it evokes strong semantic responses, and we're able to use that here in order to decode the words. So you don't have to ask them to do any particular visualization task. So we saw 2 peaks in accuracy. One was during the symbol presentation, so around 150 to 200 milliseconds, and one is during the choice presentation, about 100 to 330 milliseconds. So here, there is a difference between the onset of the semantic representation when you see the symbol. It starts at about 150 milliseconds, and when you see the choice, it starts at about 100 milliseconds. So we need to do a better controlled experiment to actually compare that delay, but here it appears that the delay in if you see a symbol as opposed to the actual word could be about 50 milliseconds, but we'd have to do a more controlled study to actually study that. We do see a delay in the onset of your semantic representation when you see this symbol. We saw that the behavioral results actually indicate that the learning is much earlier than we might have thought given the 2 versus 2 results. Again, that was partially due to guessing, but probably also due to the fact that people have somewhat less of a solidified mental representation during the first few trials. They're better at reading it than we are, and then as they get later in time, it becomes more solidified, and we're more able to pick it up with EEG and our machine learning models. So during symbol representation, we see a really less lateralized signature to the accuracy, the semantic representations. During choice presentation, it's much more robust, it's distributed, and it's more central parietal. And we have evidence for there being about a 50 millisecond delay when you have to do the symbol reading as opposed to the word reading, but we'd have to do a more controlled study to actually confirm that. So there's lots of work left to do here. I think this is an interesting venue. Sorry, I just heard something, but well, I'm almost done. So we're wondering if the representation, your semantic representation after you read the symbol, is it similar to the semantic representation after you see the choices, or is it completely different? We also could extend this to other learning scenarios like generalizing to new stimuli or maybe asking about curriculum presentation strategies. I'm also working with Janet Worker, who is at UBC, on seeing if we can do a similar thing in babies. So babies are acquiring their L1, of course, and so can we see the semantic representations of words in babies? Probably, do word vectors work for that? I don't know. That's an interesting question, and one I'm looking at with Janet Worker. So with that, I'll take your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.